It is funny that we're both very present here, all of us together, and we're all so far apart and we have this technology in the way. Just how you can both connect and be distant, and being aware of what's between us that connects us and what's between us that keeps us apart. Two other things, Dita or Teresa, do you have a bell, maybe at 9:28? If it's possible to ring a bell loudly, because this is the day that George Floyd was killed, and he was knelt on for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And so we're being asked if we can, we meaning whoever cares about this, is asked to pause for 2 minutes. So like 9:28 to 9:30. So if it's okay with you, we'll just pause then, and do feel free to just sit or kneel or make a cup of tea or whatever you just, it's up to you what you want to do with that space. There's no requirement, but I would really appreciate stopping for those 2 minutes, wherever we happen to be, to remember George Floyd and much, much more. And do feel free to look away and give your eyes rest or whatever, because I'm afraid there's no PowerPoints. There's just me telling a story. That's it. So if you're sitting comfortably, then I'll begin. And I guess I want to begin with yesterday, which I found really, really powerful. Really, I felt very full. Didn't particularly sleep last night, which hopefully means that I'll be much slower in my speaking today. And that was, I wasn't sleeping so much because I was really deeply moved by what we were hearing from you in the morning, and then from Dita and Eva, but then particularly from Milka in the afternoon. And just something about hearing that connectedness with the land for the Sengwer Indigenous peoples in Kenya, and for the Ogiek when we heard from Katello too. So just something about really listening to that depth of connection, and just what the land is and what our ancestors are. And as well as that, I guess, just something about how straightforward it is to make decisions together. So just that actually it's really straightforward. If we don't hand our power over to others to do it for us, to governments, to political parties, to whoever, as if they could do it for us, if we do it ourselves, it's a question of taking the time, sitting with each other, listening deeply, and deciding on what matters. That's it. So I kind of feel like the week's over and I'm happy to go now. That's not true. But just there's something very simple about what we need. We kind of thinking about political systems and do we do this, do we do that? There's something very, very simple about what's needed, which is that real space of safety and listening, deep listening. And what we were hearing from them was just the time that they take, and also the acknowledgement of the ancestors at the start. And we're all becoming living ancestors, by the way. Some of us are closer to that than others, but when you become a living ancestor, then you're really, you're carrying a lot. You've got a lot of experience, and that is really valuable. And that is really important. And so it doesn't suddenly happen that you die, though I'm sure it does suddenly happen that you die, but it also doesn't suddenly happen. It's like a process of really, really, really acknowledging that you're present, of becoming present, of being here, and then being in that presence, enabling others to be present, and then dying, and whatever happens next happens next. And I guess there are a couple of other places I want to begin from. And one was just listening to Yin talking about, and others talking about being on unceded territory. And we heard that on Sunday, those of us who were there on Sunday, listening to Brian from Nova Scotia, and we'll hear him tomorrow, and Sherry Pick 2 from my people tomorrow, who always begin by saying they're on the unceded lands that have not been handed over, power that hasn't been handed over, normally to the Crown, to the UK Crown in Canada, elsewhere. And this is what kept me up last night. I was just really thinking, none of us are on unceded territory. None of us have handed our power to this system. None of us need to have handed our power to this system. And in fact, when you talk about unceded territory in Canada, you're talking about lands where there was no treaty between the Crown and the First Nations. But even where there was treaty, as I expect we'll be hearing from Brian and Sherry tomorrow, even where there was treaty, where there was agreement between the First Nations and the UK, the Crown, British Empire arriving, the agreements were mostly about, yeah, you can come and fish. Yeah, you can come and trap some beaver. Yeah, you can come and do this or that. It was an agreement. It was a welcome, really. It was a toleration. It was a whole range of things, but it certainly wasn't a handing over of power. But it was used that way. And Andy Whiteman's book about Scotland is The Poor Had No Lawyers. The laws used in both cases to really use power, to then, it's an excuse for using violence and power to force people off their land and to take their land from them. So there's something about what would it be to feel like we're not living on unceded territory? What would it feel like to feel that I'm here, where I live in Portobello, in Edinburgh, in Scotland. But this is not ceded territory. This land can't be ceded because the land is, if you remember what Catello was saying yesterday, he was saying that for the Yogic, the land is everything. And he wasn't meaning just that bit of on the map. He was meaning the land, he was meaning the trees, he was meaning the moorland, he was meaning the bees, he was meaning the flowers, he was meaning the cows, he was meaning the elephants, he was meaning the whole, that whole breathing, living world that we are. It reminded me of something that Dieter had said earlier, which was about just really letting yourself feel your breath and feel yourself being breathed, which I would recommend trying. In fact, I'll try it. So just feeling that breath, and that breath is us being breathed and us breathing. It's all that, all those trees, all those plants, all those creatures, that plankton, those oceans, all of that is making that air that we're breathing. It's a living being. It's something that's between us. It's not a random, it's not something spiritual in a kind of abstract sense. It's a sacred breath. It's who we are. It's what enables us to be. So there's just something about really deeply recognizing that we're part of this. We're utterly part of this. We can't live apart from this. And that we've been living in a culture or in a domination system that persuades us that we are not that we're something separate, that we're something exceptional. And that's really the core, or in fact, all I want to say really is just that there's this sense of exceptionalism. And so when I'm talking about that storm, that the eye of the storm, I'm really trying to suggest that we're living in this calm bit. If you're privileged, and if you're on this call, you're probably privileged enough. I mean, suffering in all sorts of ways and struggling in all sorts of ways, but privileged enough to be on a Zoom call. So just, I'll assume that, okay, I may be wrong, and I apologize, but in a sense, we're privileged enough to be here. So we have this privilege, we're in the middle of this calm bit, and we can see outside the wall, you know, the way an eye of the storm works, where it's calm in the middle and there's these huge winds and storm around, really vast around, swirling around, and you're in the calmness in the middle. And I suggest that that's how this system works. So we're in our privilege, we're in this calmness, and around it, this privilege, this calmness is erupting ecological disaster, is erupting suffering on people working in all sorts of parts of the world for us where we get things so cheaply from. I mean, there's amazing statistics there. Was it Jason Hickel was saying 80% of the global economy is produced from labor and resources in the global south, 80%. 5% of the profit from that goes to the global south. So we have this whipped up storm of ecological and social disruption and exploitation around us. And we feel like we're kind of protected, and we put up walls against it, and we try and stop it coming at us. And maybe we bring people over. So maybe, you know, the people who don't have land get the vote, women get the vote, civil rights happens, people get pulled in to this, so that now you're, and some people start to earn money. In Liberia, you start to be earning money from palm oil, working on palm oil plantations. So suddenly the kind of the economic growth in Liberia goes up because people are earning money. Maybe there's a big disaster there and money goes in to try and help. So again, economic growth, it goes up. So there's just this extraordinary notion of being on the inside of this, while at the same time, those very people who are now earning money have had their lands taken from them in Liberia. Yeah, they've been pushed off their lands. They're no longer actually able to sustain themselves and sustain their communities, and some of them are getting jobs and some of them aren't. It looks like growth, it looks like improvement. In reality, it's growth and improvement on the basis of utter devastation. So that was the eye of the storm image, was just that we're on the inside of this calm and we're a bit terrified. And then we try and control it, we try and produce, and we get persuaded to fear and to give power to those in authority to protect us from the consequences of our actions. But the other thing is, it's not just an external process. It's not just a process out there that's happening in the world. It's a process that's happening in here. And that's kind of what this week's about, is trying to contact, well, how does this happen in here as well as out there? How does this sense of fear, of being surrounded, of being kind of being okay, I'm all right, I'm sane, I'm functional, I'm a dad, I'm all these sorts of things. But then there's a fear that's based on something that's really quite insubstantial. That's based on something that's quite threatening. So I just wanted to kind of suggest that there are kind of three ways I find that are really useful to look at that process. And I really just want to suggest going back to school is quite a useful way of thinking about, one way of thinking about how this happens inside us. And I'll have to time this right. Okay, just having seen the time. No, okay, given time, I won't go there just now, because I'm just seeing, I'm going to pause for 2 minutes in a little bit. So I'm just going to have to readjust slightly. So I want to come back to that internal experience in a moment, in about 12 or 30 minutes time. But just now, I'll just take you somewhere else, which is around the stories of dispossession. So that music, which was really lovely from Kim Carney at the start, and that was up one of the glens, and the stories, as many of you will know, the stories of dispossession in Scotland are very much around the clearances, just as the stories of dispossession in England are very much around the enclosures that happened there, which is again use of the law, use of power to push communities off their lands and push them into marginal places where they have very little choice but to do what they're told, whether that's to go abroad or whether that's to work in factories, whatever else. And when I was up in one of the glens, I was hearing about what had happened at Glencoe, and that General Wolfe, who was at the Redcoats general, the British government general, who defeated the other Highlanders at Glencoe. It was a much more complex battle than just Redcoats and Highlanders. The Highlanders were divided amongst themselves, which is how colonialism works, divide and rule. But the general who defeated them there also saw how well they fought, how powerfully they fought. And at that time, as is common, the Highland culture, the Highland dress, the plaid, the music, the bagpipes, the claymores, swords, all these were forbidden. So what you do is you try and break people's connection to their lands and break people's connection to their culture, break people's connection to their sense of connectedness. And that's really crucial if you're going to push colonialism out on people. But General Wolfe saw how well they'd fought, and he said to them, well, if you come to Canada, if you come to Quebec, you can keep your plaid, you can keep your claymores, you can keep your language, you can keep your bagpipes, and you can come and fight for us there. And a lot of them did, because they'd lost everything and they went over. And then, of course, they did in Canada what had been done to them. Yeah, they became part of that same force. And you can see that right the way through. I mean, you can see that right away from the Romans, that kind of movement of people from one place to another to carry out that which they wouldn't necessarily do on their own people, but they will do on other people, having been persuaded that those people are lesser than themselves. So a real pattern there of dispossession, and then using that dispossession to dispossess others elsewhere, which is really quite horrendous. And earlier than that, way earlier than that, 1609, the statues of Iona was where the Highland chiefs were told they had to send their heirs down to the lowlands. They had to go to the education in English-speaking Protestant schools. So again, way before what happened to in the clearances and to the clans themselves was already happening to those who should have been responding to them. It was already happening that they were being told, they were being torn away and becoming part of that force that was exploiting rather than being able to speak up for and stand up for their own peoples. So that process of being torn from your lands and being torn from each other is really kind of, as we saw yesterday in Eunice's picture of all the countries of the world that Britain had invaded, which was just about everywhere bar 3 places. It's quite an extraordinary map to see. Not that Britain alone has done this, Europe as a whole has done this, but Britain's been part of that. And Britain continues with a very extraordinary story of exceptionalism. We have a House of Lords full of people who are there by virtue of inheritance, or are there because they've been appointed. We have a crown that's supposed to be in charge. We have no constitution. We have religious figures who sit in the House of Lords by right, which only happens in Iran as well as here. So the UK is a very exceptional place in a very unhappy way. It's a very unusually, and I'm sure many other places are also equally unusually contorted in their inability to be equal with others and their need to insist on their being exceptional and being different. Just remembering a lovely, it's a lovely prayer or song, which is that deep peace of the running wave to you, deep peace of the flowing air to you, deep peace of the quiet earth to you, deep peace of the shining stars to you. Just wanting to come into this moment and really breathe in and just feel what's the contrast between that kind of forces of dispossession, that kind of brutality that happens out there in the world, and then that being here, just actually breathing and being in our living bodies and feeling the the goodness of being alive and this present moment of being here. And I'd suggest it's something that we're really pushed out of. We're really pushed out of, and just let ourselves come back into it. Just really feel and hear the rain or the traffic or the birds or the silence, whatever it is, just coming back into presence. So I guess I'm just hoping that you can feel the alternatives inside, like there's a kind of racing world of big important things happening. And then there's a kind of a being present world, just being ourselves, present to ourselves and to each other. And they're not actually different worlds. When I used to teach, I remember this Japanese student coming up and drawing on the wall. I'd drawn, it was a whiteboard or a blackboard. I'd put discontinuity as being a good term for what we learn in our culture, in the dominant culture. Discontinuity, we're isolated from each other. There's the environment, there's humans, they're separate. There's all these sorts of separations. And then I put continuity on the other side, which I kind of like to describe the kind of ways in which the Sengwer or the Ogiek and other people live. And she came up to the blackboard and she drew a line between the two, just saying there's a continuity between these states. There's a continuity between being in a place of isolation and discontinuity and being in a place of continuity. So there's just something about reclaiming ourselves in when we're feeling frazzled and feeling caught up in power, and when we're and then connecting that to when we're not. And I'm just having a very weird experience because I put that timeline down 9:28. I'm up against that, so I just want to convey that to you, that I normally flow in a very different way, but because I've placed a deadline on me of 9:28, I haven't gone down the avenues I would have gone down. So I'm just letting you know that that's what's happened to me. It's just an interesting thing to have done, to kind of to want to honor somebody and really be part of that and not ignore it, and yet at the same time kind of be feeling thrown off balance by that. So I'm just want to acknowledge that. Just that's part of where I am. Yeah, it's very painful to be thinking about what happened in America there, what happened to somebody having a knee on their neck, and thinking about that as being something which is really so pervasive, just such the way that the military, industrial, all of that works, that's the way that possession of Canada happened too, and of Australia. I mean, the horrendous pulling away of kids from their parents. So it wasn't just the statutes of Iona, it was also, that's what happened in reservation schools. Aboriginal kids taken from their families, Canadian, First Nations kids in Canada taken from their families, and just seeing how education works, which I want to come on to in the next bit, but just the way in which that kind of breaking happens in our own society too. It didn't just happen there, it happens, I would suggest, to each of us on the way through. So I guess that's what I want to return to, is just that actually what's happened, what we've done to others, we've done to ourselves, and actually reclaiming that, recognizing that, realizing that is part of then being able to liberate ourselves, to be able to do this very, very differently rather than just repeat it. So I'd like to stop now and just give we're about to be 9:28, and just stop a few minutes. Okay, thank you very much. Oof. Okay. this week's a very hard week. It's a very good week. I'm really loving it. It's not so hard to actually do all this stuff with letting ourselves feel and be real rather than be performing. is really good, but it's not, it's a different thing to giving a lecture or something like that. It's like, here we are together. Quality of listening enables quality of speaking. Quality of speaking enables quality of listening. We're all in this together, as it were, in that real way. But I wanted to I just want to quickly touch on three things, and then we can break into groups and just take a little moment in smaller groups. And that's just, I find a really helpful way of understanding how this possession happens to us in this kind of dominant society that I'm in anyway, is partly through the schooling process as an example of it. It's a very good example of what happens, and it's just, we learn it in the body. So we learn to be dissociated and to be possessed, and that there isn't a safe place to be. We learn that in our bodies. And very simply, if some of the people that I lived with in Africa, when they're infants, 3 to 4 month old infants are held like 99% of the time, daylight time. They're held, they're in contact. They know that they are part of a wider web of beings, that, you're born from somebody. You don't arrive alone into the world. That's not where we begin from. We don't begin alone. We arrive, we're born from somebody. We're very much in relationship right from the start and before the start. We are utterly relational beings. That's what we and all creatures are. And yet we're taught that we're not. We're taught that we're isolated. The kind of Lord of the Flies story, that if we're left to ourselves will be horrendous. And I'm sure you've read the actual story of the kids in the South Seas who got shipwrecked and took really good care of each other. And that's what we do. We take care of each other. That's who we actually are, if we haven't been so viciously treated by this civilizational process. But we're told that we're not trustable. We're told that we're not okay. And when we believe that, then we feed the machine that we come to depend on, and which is destroying our world utterly. So I just want to suggest simple ways in which we learn it. So one is that, so for Aka kids, they're held 99% of the time, daylight hours. Obviously at night, they're cuddled in with bodies, but during the daylight time, they're held 90% of the time. And in studies in the States and in Netherlands, kids are touched 12 to 20% of the time. Right, so that's a big difference, 99% to 12 to 20. And then by 7 to 8 months, amongst the Aka, it's about 3/4 of the time. And in those other studies in Holland and America, it was less than 10% of the time. And actually, I think in the clinical literature, if you have less than 5%, then that's seen as something clinically damaging, even in our own system. So in our own system, we acknowledge in the sense that our normality is severely close to damaging. And if you think about it, we're brought up in situations where, mums, dads, whatever, are under incredible stress, and we're living alone, separate from others. There's not a bunch of folk around who are going, "Give me that baby," which is what I or other grandparents would do, whatever. You kind of, they're not being held by the same person all that time. There's a kind of a passing back and forth and a celebration, and kids are absolutely amazing and wonderful and annoying and aggravating and shut the hell up. But, they're livingly part of the process and welcome, rather than being this kind of burden that somebody has to tolerate as they're trying to get on with other things in their life. So it's really hard being a parent in this culture. So this is no blame on us as parents, but just that experience of not having the contact, of being left alone, and at night often being left alone in their own rooms or whatever else. This whole notion that you should stand on your own 2 feet before you can even walk. The whole push to so-called independence, which actually leads to people who are very, very dependent, very, very codependent, rather than able to actually be themselves. So there's that experience of being isolated, of being atomistic, what I call being that the world comes down to a world in isolation. We're fundamentally alone, rather than the reality, which is that we are utterly relational beings. That's who we are. We're totally relational, and it's then unlearned through that process of very early, but it goes on. And then the experience of going to school itself, that kind of going to school and back, that embodied feeling. You go to school, you come back. You go to school, you come back. You go between these two worlds. There's two worlds. There's a world of rationality and competition and getting ahead, and then there's a world of home, which is supposed to be a world of emotion, and where you're not supposed to be competing with your brother, whereas you are supposed to be competing when you're at school. You get these two different stories going on, two very different pictures of how the world should be. You get this notion of one's a world of story, and I've said this before, but the Father Christmas story one is one I find really helpful, because it's one that's told to little kids, and it's magical, and there's Father Christmas, and oh wow, yes, 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 and then the whole point of the story is that at some point you get told it's not true. That's the whole point of that story. I don't mean in origin, where it came from in Siberia, and the actual story of shamans coming down the poles and all that bloody brilliant stuff, and the other stories that it would have amalgamated with. Those are wonderful. And in most cultures, you have stories that you learn when you're little, and then they get richer and deeper as you get older. You learn more and more. You go through initiations, you go through all sorts of things that really deepen your understanding. But in this culture, that story has a really important purpose, which is to break your faith in stories. Stories are not true. Facts are true, stories aren't true. Yeah, your personal feelings, well, they may be interesting or nice or whatever else, but they're not true. The facts over there are the truth. So we learn that dualism in the embodied movement, homeschool, but also through other forms like that kind of story, where the point is to learn that it's not true. There's a lie being told to you, and you can't believe what you're being told. Don't believe your parents, adults, whoever else. So there's that atomistic, isolated experience, which is not who we are. We're utterly relational. And then there's that dualism, that experience of a split world, but it's one that you learn in the body, because it's not actually a split world. You go racing up into your head, you go up and away from your body to try and deal with the feelings of being isolated and being cut off and being under threat. And you go up here, you go somewhere, it's still all embodied. It's still happening in the body, but you're trying to control those feelings of terror and those feelings of isolation and loneliness and worthlessness and all sorts of feelings down there that feel like that kind of storm that's there, that you need to be in the calmness, stay in the rationality, stay up above it, stay away from it. And of course, that isn't how the world actually is. Utterly connected. We're utterly dependent on the same air, dependent on the soil, dependent on the earth, dependent on each other, born from people, in touch with people. We're utterly relational beings, but we learn to believe that we're isolated and that we're split between kind of rational. Somebody here, I think it was James, talking about like the word rationality, like being rational. And Kay Milton's got a lovely thing about being rational, that rational is thoroughly emotional. it's motivated thought. It's thought that's moving. Rational thought is thought that's moving. It's motivated by emotion, by feeling. There's not a split between the rational and the feeling. It's the same world. And the third and the last one, before we break into groups, just that the notion of progress. So I just want to say that's the third way for me in which we get separated from being able to be in the moment. And if you think about the way that kids are seen as kind of lesser than adults, and then old people are seen as kind of like lesser than adults, so back then you weren't really yet the thing, you weren't yet it. And then, oh, look at these people, they're completely past it. Yeah. There's some period where you're it. Nobody's yet discovered when it is, because it never really happens. Because if we're not all it, none of us are it. But that's the notion of progress in your life, that I remember saying that to students, I'm going to say kids, students at university, around the way that you go to school, or you're going and you're waiting for the end of the day, going through these atomized subjects, all split up into different subjects. Like, it's not a connected learning, it's a split learning. You're waiting for the end of the day, then you're waiting for the weekend, and then you're waiting for the holidays, and then you're waiting to be able to get out of school, finish school, get to university or to a job, and then to retire, and then to die. And the last bit's the punchline. I don't know whether it works for you, but it works for them, which is that actually, of course, you're not waiting to die. You're not, but this notion that you're on the way to somewhere, that there's somewhere else which will be it. This notion of progress in our lives, that at some point we'll get there. If only we could finally get there, as opposed to this mess that we are, this person who's giving a talk that's reasonably okay and not particularly okay and fine and good and bad, whatever else. This is the mess we are. The person that's listening and giving some of their attention, some of their attention's elsewhere, and whatever. That's the mess that we are. So just to actually really accept ourselves, the fullness of who we are, rather than believe that we have to get somewhere else to be something, get to the top of that ladder, become something else, that will somehow mean that we feel okay about ourselves. We can only feel okay about ourselves right now in the mess we are, and that mess is a real richness. It's a real welcome richness. And so what I was going to ask was whether you would be willing to break into groups of 4 and just think back to, yeah, somebody asked for the 3 notions. So the first notion was atomism, which is the sense of the self in isolation, that reality comes down to being isolated rather than connected. And the second was dualism. So that's the experience of a split world, and one half is superior to the other. And you can think of that in terms of humans and nature, and it plays out in gender, it plays out in racialization, it plays out in all sorts of ways. But dualism is that split in the world. And the third one was progress. So that notion that you're on the way to somewhere better, rather than it's really good to learn to be here now in the relations that you're in. Frenchy, do you want to go?
Sorry, I just wonder if you'd go back to the thing you were saying about rational and emotional being kind of linked together, and I somehow didn't quite get it.
Well, it's Kay Milton. It goes back to William James actually, but it's just the notion that your rational thought is motivated thought. But if you think about being rational, you're thinking something through. Yeah, you're trying to think something through, and it's motivated thought, and it's motivated by emotion. Emotion, it may be curiosity, maybe all sorts of things, but it's that emotion which, so it's not happening up somewhere like a computer, rational, and then there's the body and emotions down here. It's that emotion is what makes it rational. That's what makes it, gives it motivation and movement and drives it. So yeah.
Okay, good, thank you.
Thanks for asking. Yeah. So just wanted to ask if you would be willing to break into groups of 4 and just like maybe do a round. And just maybe go around and just if you say whatever you like, use the time however you like. But what I'm suggesting is you go around and just spend maybe 3 minutes each in that, just saying something of your experience of childhood. And you can say, that was nothing like my childhood. I had a wonderful time. It was all brilliant. That's great. There's no problem with that. So you don't have to fit into what I've said, or you can complicate it in some way, or you can, if what I've said reverberates, maybe just share some way in which that felt true to you. I want to kind of shift slightly now, which is, and we'll see how this goes, which is kind of shifting to, I guess what I'm hoping is what you've been able to feel is the amount of shaping that's happened that renders us feeling powerless. So maybe that hasn't worked. Okay, I'm just letting you know that that's what I've been trying. I've been trying to make so it doesn't matter if it's worked or not. I just want to be upfront about that, kind of like to feel both how much we are controlled from outside. We have an economy where, I mean, in Scotland in the last 10 years, the billionaires had 2.7 billion 10 years ago. They've now got, what was it, 22 billion 10 years later, yeah? So in Scotland, which is a nice social democratic country, which is very welcoming and all the rest of it, it's actually driven by the same economic system where people have to be made poor. For people to be very rich like that, others have to be very poor. There's a direct relationship, just to be clear about that. It doesn't happen without, the one happening doesn't happen without the other. So there's an incredible impoverishment that goes on. And there's a need for people to feel insecure in the system. We wouldn't accept it if we didn't feel insecure, didn't feel frightened. There's a need to generate fear, to be able to stay abiding by a system which exploits, if not us, then others. And if not others, then the world. And if not the world, then the future. So there's we're in a very vicious system. And at the same time, we're in a very extraordinary sort of society. And I guess maybe a difference between the system itself, which has a logic to it, which is utterly destructive, and the society and culture, which has a real wonderfulness to it. And just thinking back to what happened 2 weeks ago on Kenmure Street in Pollokshields in Glasgow, which some of you will be very aware of, some of you may not be, but it was quite an extraordinary morning where the UK Home Office van came to pick up, well, to steal Mr. Singh and Mr. Sedev from their tenement flat on Kenmure Street at dawn, to steal them away, to take them away because they didn't have their papers in order. One of them had been around for 12 years. One was a mechanic, one was a chef, I think, and you know, they've been around for ages, but they didn't have the money or whatever else to be able to get their papers in order, or maybe their papers weren't even in order. And if you talk to somebody from India and what the UK has done there, and then that we have a right to, anyway, I won't go into the history, but staying with what happened, you know, so they were stolen away put in a Home Office van to be taken off. But because of a huge amount of preparation, has to be said, it didn't happen out of nowhere. People arrived on the street, neighbours arrived down on the street, knew what to do. One guy got under the van, held onto it, had to stop it moving. Others arrived, and people arrived throughout the day to block that van so that it couldn't drive them off. And hundreds of people arrived. I'm reporting from friends who were there. I wasn't there, but it sounded absolutely extraordinary. And lots of police arrived, and then police horses arrived, and police in riot gear arrived. So it was a really escalating situation. But the people on the ground stayed calm and stayed peaceful and refused to move. And it's much more painful. Good things, good things. It's just funny, isn't it? Just how people being who we are just really touches in a way that hearing somebody being horrendous, is very. I can feel very great compassion and sympathy for the person being harmed. I find it much harder to feel compassion and sympathy for the people doing the harming. But it's when people are behaving as we are as we are made to do, which is relationally and out of care. And what I was going to say was that the chant this was, "These are our neighbours, let them go." So these are our neighbours. These are our neighbours. These are us. These people are us. Let them go. These people are us. Let them go. These are our neighbours. So yeah, we're different. These are our neighbours. Let them go. And in the end, the chief inspector released a statement saying that they would be returned to their community. And that's just an extraordinary phrase. They'd be returned to their community, like an acknowledgement that that was their community. These two folk who had originated from India, who lived on Kenmure Street, it's their community. They're being released to their community. So just quite an extraordinary, both the upwelling of people saying, no, we care, and you can't do this to us. And also that recognition of these people as being us, and even that coming from the police in the end, a recognition that they belong. So I just want to go back to stuff from yesterday, which is about that, yes, our ancestors are really thinking about our parents, our grandparents, our siblings, our whatever. That's important to recognize how much we're shaped by the histories that we carry, and the political histories there, the cultural histories, those, the stories that go into making us. Our upbringing, going to school, those friends, those, where we grew up, that's really important in terms of shaping us. And then thirdly, but probably most crucially, is where do you live right now? Do you care about those around you right now? That's the third part of belonging. That's the active belonging. And last year in Scotland, every party in Parliament, apart from the Tories, voted to extend the franchise to everybody living here, wherever you're from. You have the right to vote. If you're a refugee, you have the right to vote. It wasn't extended as far. There were asylum seekers at some point weren't, but anyway, it was extended as far as they could manage to say, basically, if you live here, you belong here. Yeah, so really quite a powerful statement, alongside, as I say, an economy which is really vicious and a power structure which is really unable to act. But nevertheless, really powerful stories of belonging that are inclusive in that way, not belonging as in I belong because you don't, but I belong and you're welcome too, and you enrich my being here. And as I say, with the Sengwer and the Ogiek, there are people who live there who are not originally Sengwer and Ogiek, but who live as Sengwer or Ogiek. There's a fluidity in those kind of societies too, which isn't necessarily apparent from the outside. And I want to just go back to 1997, sitting on the top of a bus, going past Haymarket in Edinburgh, going past the station, and listening to two people behind me on the top of the bus. This is just before the referendum for a parliament here. People were kind of discussing whether they wanted to have a parliament or not, well, whether they want to renew the parliament that was adjourned in 1707. And one person said to the other, well, if Egg can do it, then I'm sure we can too. And Egg's this little island of which at that point it was 67 people living on it, and they had, well, that year they had bought the land back from the landowner, taken it back into community ownership. And what I found extraordinary was just listening to those two behind me, thinking, wow, that's amazing. The impact of 67 people doing something, just like the impact on Kenmure Street of a bunch of half a dozen people doing something at the start of that, because it takes somebody to begin that process. Just the impact that we have when we dare to take that step of care for each other and for ourselves, and we dare to take back that power in a peaceful way and to do something that says, well, actually, we can take responsibility. We don't have to hand it over to the system. We're not actually reliant on it for our well-being. We're reliant on each other. So I found that a really powerful, it was amazing to hear them say that. And then the vote was, I think, 75% for a parliament. And then since then, there's been quite a lot of land reform legislation, which has allowed for communities to buy back their land, take their land back into community ownership. Now, it's very small. I mean, though on the Western Isles, I think it's about 3/4 of people are now on community lands. So in some areas it's big, but in general, it needs to be much bigger, but that would require actually taking land back. So that's a bit like not compensating the slave owners, which is what the UK has done until we paid the interest on that till 2012, I think. The billions equivalent that we paid to slave owners for the right to stop them having slaves. We didn't pay it to the slaves. They didn't get anything. We paid the slave owners, and the oil companies now looking for the same kind of deal, where they get paid billions for not extracting oil. But we need a system which actually hands the land back from the Duke of Buccleuch and others who have a vast amount, that actually takes the land and says, no, this belongs to communities. It's a very straightforward move. There are some very simple, straightforward moves to take back the land and get the place back into a state where we can actually take care of each other rather than be doing that on the edges, in the fringes. So there's been a lot of land reform legislation, and so where we live here in Portobello in Edinburgh, we did the first community right to buy back in 2016, 2017. And so that's good, but as I say, it's not a structural shift. And I just wanted to talk for a little bit here about the Extinction Rebellion experience, which is another way of relating to government and to systems, which is to be making demands of it. So in Extinction Rebellion Scotland, we had these 3 demands of government. And again, remembering the first meeting back in 2018 in November, in the middle of Edinburgh. And I remember it was a packed hall. You couldn't fit everybody in. A whole bunch of us had come back up from blockading the 5 bridges in London. We blockaded the 5 bridges in London for a day, stopped all the traffic, and everybody was surprised, including ourselves, that so many of us had turned up and refused to move and block the traffic to say there's a climate emergency, an ecological emergency, this needs to be addressed. That was in London. A bunch of us came back up to Edinburgh. We had this meeting, which kind of started Extinction Rebellion Scotland up here. I remember listening to Jim Walker speaking at the front. I remember listening and thinking, wow, that's really lovely. He's speaking really well. And then I thought, actually, anybody here speaking would be speaking really well. It's like when you're in that moment, then everybody represents everybody else. Yeah, it doesn't need a special speaker. It just needs somebody to be willing to stand up there and be brave enough to say what we all feel in their own broken way. And it was a very profound beginning. And we had 3 demands. So one was to tell the truth, saying that government and media needs to tell the truth about the emergency we're in. Second was to act now to reduce emissions to 0 by 2025. And the third was to create a citizens' assembly, what I call trust ourselves. So the third demand is to trust ourselves, to have a citizens' assembly making decisions, not the government making decisions. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because there was then a kind of complex story, and Kate, who's here, and I were on the representing Extinction Rebellion on the stewarding group that was shaping that citizens' assembly. And I want to tell you the good and the bad story there. I'll do a sandwich, right? So the good, the bad, the good. So the good was that we asked there to be a workshop of all those. So this is people who from all the political parties, members of parliament from all the political parties in Scotland, business leaders, civil society leaders, a whole range of what they call the great and the good, but I would suggest it's something different to that. The powerful and the influential and those with reach, who are then shaping the assembly. And we asked that we have a workshop to decide the question the assembly should address. And in that workshop, people had the space to step away from being a Conservative member of Parliament or being the president of the Farmers Union or being whatever. They had the space to not be representing an interest, but just speak from themselves. And the difference in how people can speak and think when they're not supposed to be representing anybody or representing a position, but actually being their whole selves in that context is profound. And they collectively came up with a really good question for the Assembly to consider. Okay, so I can go into the questions, but I won't bother. It's just to convey the fact that when people are allowed to be their full selves with really good divergent views being presented to them, yeah, real diversity and being well held in a space, they can arrive at a really clear understanding. So that's one good slice. The bad slice in the middle is that we asked that they would consider first, what level of emergency are we in? What level of climate emergency? What level of change do we need to have? And I later heard the chief evidence guy on the radio after the assembly saying that he was surprised in retrospect that we only had 10 or 20 minutes to consider a presentation on the climate emergency. We'd asked for a whole weekend. This is a 7-weekend process. We'd asked for a whole weekend to be devoted to letting the citizens themselves, which is 104 randomly selected representative sample population, those 104 citizens to consider the emergency. They only had 10 or 20 minutes. So in other words, they had to just take the status quo vision of what's needed. And the status quo vision, as you heard from John Kerry, is 50% of the reductions we made by technologies that don't yet exist. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just fantasy. You know, if we have 12 years within which to still have a chance of a 2 in 3 chance of keeping emissions below 1.5 if you don't consider all the feedback loops. And so we're in an insane situation, and trusting the system to take us out of it is not a way through. But he was surprised in this radio interview, looking back, that they'd only had 10 or 20 minutes when Kate and I had been very clearly saying to them, you need a whole weekend to let citizens decide for themselves what level of emergency we're in, what level of response. And the other thing that happened was that apparently the economics lead, evidence lead, said that the emergency is so great that we shouldn't bother ourselves considering how we change the economic system. That would take too long. We need to deal with this emergency now, so we can't think about, it's a bit like saying, you know, turn off that exhaust pipe because there's a baby behind it who's breathing in all those fumes. No, we can't do that. We've got to deal with this emergency, this baby. What can we do about it? What can we do about it? Rather than actually just stopping. So it's just an insanity of not being willing to consider the level of emergency, and then not being willing to consider what's causing this emergency, an economic system based on growth and scarcity and fear and a need to get ahead and a need to exploit the environment and others around us, rather than one based on well-being. So the whole kind of process was one where it could have been a very good one, and the citizens did a very good job. And that's my last slice, as it were, is that the citizens themselves, as I heard from people who are part of it, did an extraordinarily good job. They could be really rational thinkers in that sense of being able to be emotional and feeling and really consider the issues. They were only considering it within quite a narrow frame, though I believe they come up with some good suggestions, but nothing that will shake the whole system, because they weren't allowed to consider the whole system. So I just wanted to say that our experience there was of an engagement where we could see the potential for citizens' assemblies, for getting a random representative sample of the population to be able to make the decisions when they're crucial. We could see the potential of that being really profound and transformative, but we could also see the way that when it's controlled by government, controlled by the status quo, it's going to be used as a way of buying you off. So the issue then is, how do you create those spaces in a way that can allow for a real transformation, rather than a way that is just a kind of wheeling a whole load of protesters into a corner where you say, well, we've done what you said, what's your problem? So I wanted to put that out there. I'm aware of time, and I'm aware I've spoken a hell of a lot. And I guess I should just finish just by saying that, we've got the COP coming up in November here in Glasgow, down the road in Glasgow, which is when the world's attention will be shifting to some degree to Scotland. And it feels like a real opportunity to create something that is really imaginative, is really visual, captures people's imaginations, that can really pass that notion back that we can collectively make the decisions we need to make. So using the attention of the world on Glasgow, not because the COP will do anything. The COP is designed to do nothing. So the COP, the Conference of the Parties, governments meeting to say they're doing something about climate change, they've been doing that for 26 times, and emissions have been rising and rising and rising. Therefore, that's not what they're doing. They're not meeting to sort the climate crisis. They're meeting to say the climate crisis is in our hands, leave it with us, it's okay, we'll deal with it. They're not dealing with it. They can't deal with it. They're incapable of dealing with it. So we need to create something very imaginative, very inclusive, that really demonstrates to people that we, the world, can make the decisions we need to make. We can't rely on the system to do so. So one idea we've had is to gather communities from the global south and the global north to be able to meet by the Clyde, to be able to have a meeting of the hearts of people sharing their experience of colonization, of being conquered, whether it's here in Scotland or in Kenya or Australia, wherever else, to share their experience and to listen to each other, to hear how that damage has happened, to hear about their connectedness, to hear about their recovering of connection. And from that, to be able to try and spark a reawakening like Egg did in Scotland. Yeah, just seeing those bunch of folk in that part of Aberdeen, or those bunch of folk in that part of Kenya, or those bunch of folk in that part of Australia, just seeing where people are struggling, but also able to reclaim that space for their hearts and that space for connection, and able then from that to be able to people to realize and to be able to wake up from this insanity that we're living in, which is that us here are irrelevant and someone somewhere else is relevant. Well, that person who thinks they're relevant is relevant because they're not going to be able to make a decision outside of this system. So it's those of us who can feel that we're not just in the system, but we're also living, breathing beings who need to connect and need to be able to make something else happen. And that's just one suggestion for a way forward with that. Okay, I'd like to stop because I'd like to open space for people to say things because I've been speaking lots. So that's me. Thank you.
I would like to hear, with in view of the potential limitations of citizens' assemblies, a bit about people's assemblies and how the two can interact, or is one better than the other, or yeah, a little bit about the difference between the two.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Okay, so people's assemblies are really a gathering of people who are concerned about an issue or a place. So when we were listening to Milka or Catello yesterday talking about the Sengwer Ogiek assemblies, that's a people's assembly. Though in a sense, if it's everybody from that community, then it's a citizens' assembly because it's representative of the community as a whole. So it's not as in those contexts, their assemblies are really are legitimate in that sense. And we heard yesterday how they just need time. That's what they need. They need time. They need connectivity and listening, deep listening and time. And then as time goes by, and I've been at their assemblies where you have men my age who take power at the start and make their claims, and it looks like everything's 50-50. You know, like half people are behind Justin, who's pushing for this Bolsonaro-like solution, and 50% are behind somebody else who's being sane. And then gradually, as time goes by, you can see who's pushing for their own. Justin's only pushing for his own interests here, really, and he's trying to get people behind him in clever ways. But if you have enough time, that falls away. In a way, that happened over the referendum in Scotland, actually, over the 2014 period. If you have time, if there's enough length of time, things can really shift in people's understanding when power, which can be an individual as much as anything else, can't grip hold of it. So people's assemblies are a gathering of people who are passionate, concerned about an issue or a place, and then citizens' assembly is a way of making that representative. So for a town or for a city or for a country, so it's a representative sample. So you'll have gender balance, you'll have ethnicity. By I think citizen assembly was around income, you know, it's around a whole range of and geography and so on. So you make sure it's representative. Those 104 people were representative of Scotland, but it's also random in that they sent out 3,000 letters to people and a certain number responded, and then from that they chose ones to represent that, you know, representative sample. So you can't push your way onto it. A citizen assembly is something which is it's a and the beauty of it is that people know that they're ignorant, and this is the key for all of us to know that we're ignorant. You know, like the thing is, I mean, Kevin Anson, who's the climate scientist who was part of the process and was incredibly effective and really just did a huge amount of work despite smashing himself up on his bike in the process. Not because of it, but just separately, still carried on working, inputting into it. He was just saying that the experts know their bit, so they're preoccupied with that, and they can't see the whole. And then politicians have their interest, so they're pushing that, and they can't see the whole. But if you have 104 citizens who know that they don't know about stuff, they can be rational, they can listen and put things together in a way that people who are experts can't, and in the way that politicians can't, because they've got their own interest to push rather than considering the whole. So citizen assembly is a way of considering the whole in that sense. It needs to be really well facilitated. So who facilitates is crucial. It needs to be well informed with the whole range of views rather than just the dominant one. It needs a really good space and process. And they can be captured. Sorry, I mean they can be captured. And we're going to go back to this in the last session on Friday when we're going to go back looking at experience in Chile around assemblies and looking at Trust People's work in England around people's assemblies, and then looking at what we've been doing in Scotland, what we're proposing, some stuff I was touching on just there at the end on Friday afternoons. Thanks, Mark. Any thoughts or questions from anybody else or feelings?
I've got a question.
Go.
You may be going to go into this detail in some other session, Justin, but I'm just interested in you saying that in the selecting of the people to be on the Citizens' Assembly, that they're representative. And I just wondered, having worked with the Forum a sort of 20, 30 years ago, where that same intention was there to say, oh, we'll have, you know, like looking in the bad old days when we were starting to get representative, oh, we can have women as well as men, no way. And then, oh, we can have mothers as well as working women, you know, and just like who decides what categories are saying that we are being representative.
Yeah. That's the kind of fundamental question, is who shapes the shaping of the assembly.
Yes.
That's something that needs to be transparent and in the open and needs to be visible to the public. And it wasn't. So Kate and I were on this stewarding group, but it was hidden away. It wasn't happening in a kind of visible form where people could feed back. And that's the whole thing, needs to be in the open and transparent and visible in that way, so that it's, so people can input, and there needs to be trust in there. So you need to have some people being in that place, yeah, shaping it, but they need to have to be responsive to people outside that space as well. So I think you can't let you know, the perfect the enemy of the good, but you can allow the good to become perfect by having transparency and really shining a light on that process as it goes forward. Kate, do you have a thought on that? No need to, if you don't. It's fine. It's fine. Okay. And
I think this is such a topic that can unfold over the course of the week, is my sense. I think for me, I'd rather stay in some of the dispossession sense that we began the meeting. I think that's very powerful, and it's almost like the citizens' assemblies, people's assemblies, is rushing to solutions before we've really bottomed out some of where we are.
That's lovely. Thank you. Mark, are you rushing to a solution, or you've got a different kind of point?
A different kind of point. It's what struck with me is really the kind of colonialisation of like childcare and how atomised that process is, and how gendered it is in terms of putting pressure on women and also excluding men often, and the whole way that, I'm not sure where we were talking about this, but it was the idea that childbirth is one thing that capitalism can't produce. It relies on, we don't, well, in most cases, the children aren't sold, so they can't be commodified, but the mindset of how children are reared, the whole process of how people are, you know, working mothers, you know, the Scottish Government rolls out more childcare so they can get back into the workplace. You know, this whole idea that it should be only women that are looking after children, the whole way in which it's medicalised, and the experts that come in and tell people how, and the way that often there isn't a community sense of responsibility for raising children and giving support to people. So if you don't have a family context where the grandparent or the friend can come in and help you when the child's not been sleeping, it's had colic or whatever, and you're left by yourself trying to deal with that, it's so inhuman. And yet it's not, as far as I can see, challenged to any extent that it should be.
Yeah, that speaks really directly to what Kate was saying, just that kind of the inhumanity of the system that we're in, and what it demands of us then, and the kind of the ways in which we treat each other within that we don't want to. So we're pushed to it. We're pushed to have very little choice in terms of our taking care of our kids or whatever else. It's quite, but I guess the other side of that is that you know, the world's just full of miracles. So apologize if that doesn't quite follow the dispossession theme, but it's like it's a miraculous world. It's absolutely extraordinary that we exist at all. You know, the fact that we're here is just phenomenal. I mean, it is phenomenal. We're not going to be here that long, each of us. It's like, so, you know, breathe into it. This is a really effing amazing thing to be here as humans. And there's something about allowing that up through the toes, as Kim did in her singing at the start of this, just really feeling that belonging, regaining that belonging, which she's been doing, really letting ourselves belong and care, and just allowing that to be there really allows for miracles to happen. I just want to be specific about that. which is that, you know, things that otherwise get called coincidences kind of seem to just happen when you deeply care in that way. So just kind of, when I was at the XR Rebellion, April 2019 stuff in London, and then there was David Dimbleby happened to be doing a video on climate change at that moment, you know, that week. And so when I was arrested and was in the courtyard with 12 police officers, the older guys who would normally be deniers were finding it very difficult because David Dimbleby, the man what knows, had just said this is real. So it was kind of hard for them. So that kind of coincidence, or I remember when my parents were involved in starting Shelter, that housing organization. And in the 2 weeks before it started, Cathy Come Home, a film about homelessness that was really vivid and powerful, happened to be on the telly a couple of weeks earlier. Just happened to be, it wasn't arranged by anything. When we went for the community buyout here in Belfield, it happened that 2 days earlier, the right to buy had been extended to urban areas. We didn't know that, that happened to be the case. I remember coming out of a bunker when we occupied a Margaret Thatcher's bunker in Knapp Hill in the Chilterns, where she wanted to hide away from the bomb situation that she was creating in the world, along with Ronald Reagan and others. We came out of occupying this bunker, and we came up and we were holding hands in a circle under the beech trees, and an owl came down and sat on the branch, you know, and like appreciated us being there. And it's like, these things are not, there's not room for these things in the way that we're taught the world is. We're taught that those are just odd, peculiar things that don't fit a rational, in the sense of disconnected, not rational in that lovely sense of motivated thought, engagement, openness, curiosity. So I just want to say there's a lot of stuff outside the paradigm. There's a lot of support and connectedness and engagement. And I found that when I was arrested in that April, somebody had been running a Joanna Macy workshop in the middle of Trafalgar Square, asking you, how do you feel about being in the world right now? And then dancing, which is my favorite thing in the world, just to say. So I was just wildly dancing and then had to rush over to block the police. And I was in a state of ecstasy, really. And I had the same in the court case earlier this year, or earlier this month or last month, I can't remember, when I'd just been able to visit my grandchildren who are in London, because I was obliged to travel to London because I had a court case in London and my newly born granddaughter was in London. So I was obliged by the law to go to my court case in London and therefore could see my granddaughter. So I was ecstatic. I was absolutely happy. And I went to court absolutely happy. And I won the court case because I was absolutely happy. It felt to me, who knows, eh? So there's no way you can say logically by science that these things are the case. But my experience of reality is that there's just an extraordinary resource there, willing to support us and engage us and enable us to transform, if we can let go of putting our trust in a system that is destroying us inside and out, and put our faith in each other and that trust in the world as a whole. So just want to make that suggestion. That's not necessarily about dispossession, but it's about getting out of the possession, stepping out of the possession. We've been possessed by a belief that the world is a really narrow, frightening, scary place. And our system makes it that, but that ain't the world. That isn't who we are. So apologies for the rant, but I thought I would just let you know that.
Please don't apologize, Justin. Please rant on. I love it.
Yeah, okay. Well, yes. Keith, thank you.
Yeah, going back to very early on in your talk, you mentioned breaking the connection with the land by the powerful against the people who use the land. And over the years, we've seen almost the obliteration of common land as it's been seized into private control. And I've spent a large chunk of my life representing gypsies and travellers. I defended Dale Farm for about 6 years. And it is part of that, the ongoing conflict with gypsies and travellers reflects in that we are supposed to recognise private land as being the way it is and the way it should be. We should pay our money to our landlords, pay our mortgages to the banks, and all this. And faced with that being, you know, two fingers to that from the gypsy and traveller community is really rather too much for the authorities. And now we see them bringing into effect a law which will make sleeping in a vehicle, a box on 4 wheels or with one without consent will be a criminal offence. And this is a powerful example of just how things are going seriously wrong. And what I'd like to take from Justin's motivational emptying of one's mind and getting to grips with the reality of the world is that it is moving forwards with that confidence to tackle things like climate change, things like prejudice against gypsies and travellers, and other aspects of diversity and so on. So that's what I would say.
Thanks so much for that work, Keith, and for those words. And just to say, yeah, when power does that sort of thing, it overreaches itself and you can topple it. It's like you need to seize those moments when it steps so far, as it did with the Home Office van in Glasgow. I'm not saying that's easy, I'm not saying it's simple, but it's noticing that moments and when you can push it. But I'm aware time's up, and I don't want to hold you longer than the time that we've agreed to meet. And we're all welcome back, I think, at 11, which is only half an hour from now, if we want to attend the next session that Sophie's giving. So thank you all. Lots of love. Appreciation.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.
Yay, thank you.
Thank you. Lots of love. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye bye all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.